So this session is about information literacy, data and evidence removal in the US. I've run a few presentations and webinars on this topic over the last year. Generally, those have been aimed at medical and healthcare librarians, though I have also participated in a panel on this topic at CILIP, which had a broader focus. So it's something I've been following for a while. It's also an area that I think is very important to be keeping on top of in my job role. So I work with departments in our health and life sciences faculty. So that includes things like nursing, public health, sports science, that kind of thing. And a lot of my day-to-day work involves teaching information and digital literacy skills to students, showing them how to effectively search for evidence using various databases, other resources. Increasingly, I am talking about AI research assistants, AI search tools, how they work, where the information they provide is coming from, and how you can appraise them. But generally, that means I spend a lot of time thinking about where information comes from, what information we see, and what information we don't see, and who or what gets to decide that. And the fact of the matter is, the role of the United States in that space is huge. The US is responsible for an extraordinary amount of our research infrastructure. And I think the conversations we're having now about how incredibly reliant we all are on the US are long overdue. So it has come into quite urgent focus now, but that kind of hegemony in terms of information access is something I think we should have been talking about already. So this session is going to be a bit depressing, I am afraid, but if we can take one positive thing from it, I do think it's that the current situation has forced us to engage a bit more meaningfully with these kinds of questions. There we are. So in terms of structure, I'll be talking hopefully for about 30 minutes, possibly 35. I'm going to split things into 3 sections. Firstly, we'll go through what is actually happening in the US. Then I'll talk about how that affects us here in the UK and globally. And then we'll look at what action is being taken to address the concerns we have. And as part of that third section, I will try and spend a little bit of time on how all that has affected how I think about information literacy and how I try to teach it. So I do have a library guide that I put together early last year about this topic, which I try to keep as up to date as I can. I am a health sciences librarian, so the focus in this guide is specifically on how US government policy affects international health research and global public health. One of the things I think that is particularly challenging about all of this is that there is so much going on in the US right now, not just in the area of academic research, but also civil rights, foreign policy, immigration policy, environmental policy, and so on. And if you try and keep on top of all of it, you do just get overwhelmed and stop being able to engage at all. So I have essentially picked a lane, basically, and that lane is very specifically global health. This talk is going to focus mostly on that as well, therefore, but of course, what is happening in this space is being replicated across other areas, other subjects, and is more widely applicable. Okay, what is happening? Lots. Since the current US administration, led by Donald Trump, came into power in January of last year, 2025, we have seen some dramatic changes to United States scientific policy. So I've linked to various relevant documents here, which work together to give you a sense of the overall direction that has been taken. So we have Project 2025, first of all, which was published back in 2023 by a conservative think tank called the Heritage Foundation. So this is a policy document which sets out proposed major changes to how the US federal government is run. In terms of its approach to healthcare, it targets in particular environment and climate policies, reproductive health, DEI initiatives, while asserting that the National Institutes of Health and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, so those are institutes within the Department of Health and Human Services, are, to quote, too political and need reform. Since the new administration came in, there have been various policy documents and executive orders that have echoed these sentiments. So this Restoring Gold Standards to Science executive order in particular targets climate policies, responses to COVID, while the MAHA assessment here, the Make America Healthy Again, focuses on purported dangers of vaccines and environmental causes of autism, supposed. This CDC priorities statement, which was published last year in September, announces a focus on researching vaccine safety, again, the causes of autism, and, to quote, protecting life in the family, ending disorder on America's streets, gender ideology and protecting children, and DEI, with the latter two being something that the statement is particularly against. So if I were to pull out three main areas they all have in common, that might be vaccine policy or infectious disease, climate policy, and diversity, equity, and inclusion, though of course there is a lot more. Within this backdrop, we also have a focus on what has been described as reducing government waste, which is where DOGE, or the Department of Government Efficiency, comes in. So this was a new department that was set up to make various large-scale cuts to funding and staff across various government departments in line with the administration's policies. So DOGE has officially been disbanded now, I believe, but many of its employees do continue to work in the government in other areas. So in terms of the practical effects of these policies, we've seen various things. The first is in the context of access to information. So last year we saw the mass removal of various government web pages and data sets which were deemed to run contrary to the administration's goals, which mostly affected material related to, again, gender ideology and quotes, DEI, vaccines, the climate, long COVID. There were various legal challenges in response to this, and a lot of those pages, though not all, were subsequently restored, but then some were taken down again, so it's an ongoing battle. Quite a few government databases are simply no longer being updated. So an article, or a preprint article published in the journal The Annals of Internal Medicine last month, reports that of 82 CDC databases that they examined, almost half, so 46%, had unexplained pauses and seized or delayed updates. Of those that were paused, 87% were vaccine related, whereas none of the unpaused databases were related to vaccines. As well as removal of datasets and web pages, we also saw modifications to information. So, for example, a study published in The Lancet last July revealed undisclosed data manipulation across over 100 datasets, including changing column titles on one dataset from gender to sex. In August last year, meanwhile, the US Energy Secretary announced that past national climate reports were being reviewed and would be republished with alterations, stating that the previous assessments, again to quote, weren't fair. We've also seen the production of misleading or false information in various formats, including fallacious announcements about a connection between paracetamol and autism, and various assertions on the dangers of vaccines in general without good evidence. And then there's the threat of prevention of particular types of research on particular topics being released, with some US-based medical journals having been sent threats demanding explanations of partisanship in debate, some NIH, that's the National Institutes of Health, funded journals no longer accepting new submissions, and Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who's the current Secretary for the Department of Health, announcing an intention, which is as yet unrealized, to be clear, to ban government scientists from publishing in journals including The Lancet, JAMA, and the New England Journal of Medicine on the grounds that they are corrupt. So harking back to DOGE and that idea of nominally reducing government waste, we have also seen large numbers of grants and funding being terminated, which nominally relate to out-of-favour topics like climate research or, in particular, mRNA vaccines. The administration have also been in conflict with a lot of the major US universities, at various points withholding or threatening to withhold funding to institutions considered woke, proposing special treatment and prioritized fundings to institutions who will agree to enact various government-approved ideological policies. Here is a report produced by the journal Nature, which I'd highly recommend reading. That was published last month in January. It says that as of now, 5,844 NIH grants and 1,996 NSF grants were cancelled or suspended on topics that the administration didn't like, including vaccine hesitancy and so on. Some of those grants were reinstated, but many haven't been. In addition, according to that Nature report again, significantly fewer new grants were issued last year than normal. So 24% fewer grants in NIH compared to the last 10 years. Staff and organisations. So a lot of staff from across departments in the US government have been fired or have resigned in protest against new government policies. So during the government shutdown last October and November, hundreds of staff at the CDC were fired, but then some were reinstated very quickly afterwards. But according to the Nature report on the last slide, we're looking at something like a loss of 20% of staff across federal scientific agencies. And then we have departments that have just completely gone. So famously, USAID, which was the world's largest agency for foreign aid, that has been shut down. Various committees have been overhauled. So the CDC's Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, the existing committee was disbanded and replaced by people more aligned to vaccine skepticism. And here's just a screenshot of an article from Science from last month on the number of STEM PhDs lost over the last year, so over 10,000. So an awful lot of changes, basically. There is a lot more to say on that, and indeed on the wider picture. I could do several hours on this, but we do have to move on. We've all got places to be. I do have a big reference list at the end, suggestions for further reading, and sources you can use to keep up to date as well, so you can follow up on all of these changes. But anyway, lots of upheaval in the US. How is that affecting us here in the UK, if at all? So the United States have an extremely powerful influence on the rest of the world in a variety of domains. The first and most obvious is in terms of funding. So according to the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation, the US has been responsible for about a third of total global health funding, which just isn't replaceable money. So on this slide here, I've just got a screenshot from a report written by Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, which came out last month, which reports that the Trump administration's actions have, to quote, upended global health and humanitarian programs around the world and severely damaged global cooperation and solidarity on these issues. It goes on to assert that the human costs have been catastrophic. A few months back, the BMJ put out an article titled Earth-Shattering Trump Cuts to Global Health Still Reverberating as Who Sheds More Staff? So that reported that the World Health Organization have had to cut even more staff due to the funding deficit that the US withdrawal has left. There's also the heavy investment in US tech. So you might have seen something in the news recently about the NHS links to the tech giant Palantir and motions to break ties given Palantir's involvement with US immigrations and customs enforcement violence. And there is also what I guess you call the cultural influence of the US as well. So for example, when the US president announces a link between paracetamol and autism, that necessitates several statements from our own government in the UK and our own papers to contradict it, hence that screenshot of a slightly miserable looking Wes Streeting. Again, a BMJ article from a few months ago discusses a perceived ripple effect in Europe on vaccine hesitancy coming from the US. So to quote from that article, speaking at the World Vaccine Congress Europe in Amsterdam on the 14th of October, public health policymakers and industry leaders warned of the domino effect of messaging coming from the US. The conference also heard that investment in vaccine development and technologies had started declining as a result of the negative sentiment in the US and recent political decisions. So that article and all the ones I'm mentioning are linked in the slides. And then, probably most importantly for us as librarians, there is the US research infrastructure, which is heavily relied upon by the rest of the world. So, just to give you some background then, the US government are responsible for quite a few databases which are incredibly important and well used in healthcare research, most notably PubMed and clinicaltrials.gov. So here's just a little overview of how the US government is structured and how they're all linked. So the federal government is split into three branches, the executive, the judicial, and the legislative. I find it very hard to say legislative, but I managed it there. Well done me. Anyway, so the executive branch is the one headed by the president, so that's Trump. Within the executive branch, you have various departments, one of which is the Department of Health and Human Services, and that is currently headed up by Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who is notable for being a big vaccine skeptic. Within that, you've got a number of agencies, including the CDC and also the National Institutes of Health, which is headed up currently by Jay Bhattacharya. Within the National Institutes of Health is the National Library of Medicine, and it is that that produces PubMed, clinicaltrials.gov, and some other biomedical platforms as well, such as BLAST. So PubMed is huge. It is one of, if not the most widely used sources of biomedical literature worldwide. Whenever I run a session on literature searching for my students, one of the first things I often get them to tell me is where they would ordinarily search for academic literature. And outside of Google, far and away, PubMed comes out at the top, which makes sense because it is a really awesome resource. It's user-friendly, it's free, seems to have everything. Even if you think you aren't using PubMed, you often actually kind of are. A lot of the major other healthcare databases pull a large amount of their material from PubMed, including Embase, Europe PMC, Central, that's the Cochrane Randomized Controlled Trial Database, CINAHL, OpenAlex as well. If you're writing a systematic review of interventions, the Cochrane guidance for where you should search is Medline, Embase if you've got access, and Central. So it is worth noting then that Central and Embase pull a lot from Medline. So it's forming an outsized part of the data set there. And to clarify, Medline and PubMed, or PubMed contains Medline basically. But these Cochrane guidelines are followed everywhere when creating systematic reviews to inform policy, NICE guidelines, and so on. Moving away from the academic databases we are most familiar with then, unsurprisingly, a lot of the AI research assistant tools that are becoming popular also rely heavily on PubMed. So Research Rabbit on the right there states that its results are powered by PubMed. And Semantic Scholar. Elicit says it searches PubMed and OpenAlex. OpenAlex also indexes PubMed. Consensus, that's the bottom left one, also highlights PubMed as a source. So it is everywhere in the research landscape. It is also worth noting as an aside here that the vast majority of these AI tools are US based, with owners who are very involved in US politics. So OpenAI's president, Greg Brockman, gave around £25 million last year to a political action group that supports Donald Trump, for example. So what could go wrong? There are the obvious big concerns like a potential total loss of access to PubMed or a move to a subscription model so it's no longer free. Or perhaps the active removal or censorship of particular articles or journals, or maybe the manipulation or alteration of the indexing system. to be clear, at the moment, there is no evidence of this type of change happening. Various people and institutions are monitoring the content of PubMed for changes, which I will get to, and nobody has spotted anything really untoward yet, as far as I'm aware. But then we have the subtle potential changes, which are more likely and also, I think, in a way, potentially actually more dangerous. So fewer staff at the NIH and less funding may result in degradation of the site infrastructure, just its day-to-day running. Things may break more often for longer. We may start to see subtle alterations to PubMed's inclusion policies, perhaps to make them more amenable to including junk science, such as the fake journal Science, Public Health Policy and the Law, which RFK Jr. cited as evidence for changing vaccine policy. Or to make them more hostile to journals which the Health Secretary considers corrupt, so things like The Lancet. Again, no evidence of a change of that nature to journal inclusion criteria at present, though there are reasons to be monitoring it closely. So a few months ago, the National Library of Medicine posted that they are modernising journal selection processes, which has involved disbanding the LSTRC, which was the committee which assessed which journals got included into Medline, basically. We shouldn't necessarily immediately assume that changes along those lines will be bad. It might well be that this is just something that has been planned for a while, but we don't know. And given the environment we're in, it is something to monitor closely. There's an article I've put in the references to this slide by Elizabeth Ginexi, which I'd recommend reading on this. So she's an ex-NIH employee who discusses the sort of pressures current NIH staff are facing in their roles. So she highlights a new requirement that NIH staff connect at least one of their 2026 performance goals to the President's Management Agenda. That's a federal website where stated priorities include eliminating woke, weaponization and waste, downsizing the federal workforce, and ensuring that grants go only to high-performing recipients to advance America First priorities. So there is a lot of pressure on staff in these institutions. And then there is the indexing algorithm, which PubMed uses. I forgot I put this slide in, bear with me. Yeah, this is just, I think, an interesting demonstration of the changes in US government and how they can impact straight into PubMed. So the subject heading list for PubMed is called MESH. Previously, the subject heading for the Gulf of Mexico was the Gulf of Mexico, but the latest update to MESH, the 2026 update, has changed that now to Gulf of America. Gulf of Mexico still is an entry term, so if you search Gulf of Mexico, you will still get relevant articles, but it does just show that these subject heading lists are always political, and they always have been. Okay, back to the indexing algorithm. So I don't think I've got a lot of time to go on about this, but it is just worth knowing that in 2024, PubMed updated the AI algorithm, which is used to index new material in PubMed, which assigns relevant MESH terms. MESH terms, again, being the name of PubMed's subject heading list. Like any AI, it can be useful, but there are various problems with how it assigns terms. In particular, it has been noticed that it is bad at assigning newer terms to articles because it has less data on those terms. Basically, it's just less likely to use them. Last year, lots of us noticed that the number of results for the MESH term ethnic and racial minorities was consistently going down rather than up. So articles that had that MESH term previously were having the term removed, basically. And that essentially seemed to be because the algorithm had been re-indexing articles. And because the term ethnic and racial minorities is a newer MESH term, it was just less likely to employ it. So it didn't appear to be a malicious thing that was causing the term to disappear. It was an issue with the algorithm, as far as we can tell. But the algorithm does therefore need monitoring to mitigate that kind of effect. And when the new algorithm was announced, the National Library of Medicine said that 1/3 of articles indexed via automation will also receive human curation. You can check that quite easily, as it turns out. So I did by searching the metadata. And when I have checked, at every point I've run a check, that 1/3 stat does not hold true. It is a fair bit lower than that. So when I last checked on the 10th of this month, roughly 18% of the articles were marked as their indexing being curated, as opposed to 81% just automated, so no human involvement. Interestingly, if you check this for individual terms, the balance stays quite similar. So for the mesh term psychiatrist, for example, it's about 14% of articles with that term listed as having been curated, 80% automated. Ethnic and racial minorities, though, is quite aberrant here. So nearly every new use of that term since 2025 has been for an article where the indexing is human curated, not automated, which essentially suggests that the issue with the algorithm being bad at assigning certain terms hasn't been fixed. It's just sort of being mitigated by human intervention. So on the one hand, it is really encouraging that they are doing that. But on the other hand, we don't know what other terms should be being monitored in a similar way, or whether this one is just getting special attention because the drop was so pronounced last year. Additionally, with the government shutdown of last year, the partial shutdown we had earlier this year, coupled with staffing and funding disruptions, it does feel incredibly risky that the indexing is so vulnerable in this way. Again, there doesn't even need to be any malicious intent here before we start seeing particular mesh terms potentially get buried. There just needs to be a lack of sufficient staff time or funding to monitor it properly. So again, we haven't seen any major changes as of yet, but there are real reasons for concern, and a lot of those reasons are of the more subtle, easily missed, but just as damaging kind, I think, in the long run. Which leads me to the last section of this talk, which is what is being done about it. So first of all, there are several initiatives, some old, some new, which have been working to rescue and restore data and web pages which the administration have removed or altered. I'd highlight out of those in particular the Data Rescue Project, which is awesome. It has saved massive amounts of data which would otherwise have been lost, and the Internet Archive's Wayback Machine, which is particularly great for comparing how certain government web pages look now with how they looked a year ago. So you can compare, for example, the PubMed journal inclusion criteria as it is now to how it was a while ago, which is interesting. There are various methods in addition in which we can also keep an eye on changes to PubMed. So ZBMed, which is the German National Library of Medicine, have created a site called Pubservatory, which tracks changes to PubMed, additions and deletions over time, which is a really interesting resource. I should stress again, they have not noticed anything untoward in terms of additions or deletions as of yet. I am also, for fun, monitoring mesh terms for any danger signs. So I have a shell script, which I can use. So a shell script is a computer program, basically. And I didn't write this shell script, to be clear. That was a librarian called Mark. But what it does is basically uses an API to run automated searches for 150 at-risk mesh terms, so things like bias and DEI. And then it gives me the number of results that come up for each mesh term, so how many articles have that mesh term assigned. So I try and run that as regularly as I can, and what it does is it enables me to immediately spot if any mesh terms have had an unexpected change. Either they've gone down suddenly or they've shot up, which we can then follow up on. And over the long term, we can use that to monitor how well the algorithm's working, but also just see whether certain terms are being removed or added. I've also myself written an additional shell script which tells you the number of times mesh terms were assigned to articles every month over the last 10 years. So I can get a bigger picture of the trends over time in terms of just what kinds of research is getting published and what is getting indexed in PubMed. I keep a Google spreadsheet updated with all that information, which you are very welcome to have a look at if you'd like. Please just send me an email and I'll send you the link. It is not just passively monitoring changes, though. Fortunately, there has been work on building alternative, more stable pieces of infrastructure to prevent things like this being a problem in the first place. So the most interesting and promising of those that I know of currently is OLS Pub, which is, again, a ZB Med German National Library of Medicine initiative. So they're working on developing an open source, reliable and sustainable alternative to PubMed, which will involve sourcing all of PubMed's material independently. The goal here is international cooperation, everything open source, so that ultimately we are never in a situation where we are reliant on just one country or one agency or one government for access to key life sciences research. It is a huge project. They are currently in the process of doing community fundraising to try and get the money needed. There are lots of barriers to that, but the project website is here. I'd definitely recommend checking it out and watching one of their webinars on how things are progressing. There are 2 in English, 1 in German on YouTube, I think. And you can also sign up to a mailing list to keep up to date on that as well. And then just in terms of the day-to-day and how we as information professionals and librarians can be responding to these changes, how we can talk about these changes, incorporate them into our teaching and so on. As I said at the start, I think if we take nothing else from all this, what we should think about is the dangers of international over-reliance on the scientific output and infrastructure of one country, the dangers of relying on a government-funded database and a government-funded indexing system with an algorithm that needs constant monitoring as a first port of call for research. And that has always been a danger, regardless of who currently happens to be in the White House, and regardless of how services like PubMed may change in the future. It's something we should have been thinking about long before now. And we should always be interrogating these platforms, who runs them, how they index, what resources they do surface, and which they don't. And I think this is a really good opportunity to do that. That is also conveniently exactly the same kinds of things we are trying to teach students with regards to AI and AI literacy. One really big barrier that I am facing, and I know I'm not alone in this at university libraries, is that because of various funding and staff pressures and so on, I am having to fight more and more to get teaching time with students. And so I have to be really precious about what I choose to focus on. So it can feel really unachievable to also try and incorporate, information about political interference into research infrastructure, into the hour a term you get with a cohort, when your primary goal is more just to get them to please stop just blindly trusting ChatGPT. But if you think of them not as 2 separate areas, but as 2 applications of the same skill set, I think it becomes a lot easier. So an activity I am starting to run with students when I have the time just involves getting them to actually read through the inclusion criteria and processes for the search tools we use, and then just do some comparing and contrasting. So I spent some time in a class recently just talking the students through the consensus FAQs and discussing things like where the sources come from and why that matters, and then how the results are ranked and things like that. And they do listen, they are interested, but I think generally spending more time not just on how we search and how Boolean operators work and so on, but also where we search, why that matters, how things are connected is more important than ever. And that is just the consensus FAQs. Do give them a read. They're very silly. Just to highlight one, they mention here how they refine their results by quality for the ranking. Their primary quality signals are recency of publication, citation count, and journal reputation and impact, which we know is very flawed. But anyway, it's very informative. That is a bit of a side point. So just a bit of suggested further reading here. Some articles and resources that I found really helpful. One of the main things that kicked all this off was Hilda Bastian's excellent article, What If We Can't Rely on PubMed? That was published last February, which just talks about how much we do rely on it. The BMJ News and Views section is a really good source of information. The website Trump Action Tracker that's been put together by Professor Christina Pagel, I'm not quite sure how you pronounce her surname, but that's really informative, as well as Stat News, as well as a really good source of information. And then there is my guide as well, just to shamelessly plug that too. And here are my many, many references. Gosh, it does keep going, doesn't it? There we are. Okay, that's basically all I had to say then. So if I stop sharing, we can move on to questions and discussions.